Thinking under pressure. How to decide clearly when time, energy, and certainty are missing. Written by Aaron Kairos. Narrated by Lyra Celine. Preface. This book was not written to make pressure tolerable, productive, or meaningful. It was written because pressure already exists, and pretending otherwise distorts how people think, decide, and live. Many books begin from the assumption that clarity is the natural state of the mind, and that confusion is a temporary deviation. This one begins from the opposite assumption, that pressure is common, clarity is intermittent, and most decisions are made while something important is missing. Pressure changes the mind before it changes outcomes. It narrows attention, compresses time, amplifies emotion, and rewards speed over judgment. Under these conditions, people often blame themselves for thinking poorly, hesitating too long, or deciding badly. They interpret cognitive strain as personal weakness rather than as an environmental effect. This misinterpretation adds a second layer of damage: self-condemnation on top of constraint. The aim of this book is not to eliminate pressure or to teach mastery over it. Such promises are unrealistic and, under real conditions, often harmful. The aim is more modest and more durable, to help thinking remain intact when conditions are not. Intact thinking does not mean perfect judgment or favorable outcomes. It means thinking that does not collapse into panic, rigidity, or self-deception when pressure persists. Nothing in these pages assumes ideal circumstances. The chapters were written with fatigue, uncertainty, incomplete information, and constrained choice in mind. They do not offer techniques to optimize performance or to outcompete others. They describe how thinking actually deforms under strain, how those deformations can be recognized, and how some degree of orientation can be preserved without demanding impossible clarity. This book is meant to be listened to or read slowly, not because it is complex, but because pressure already accelerates everything else. It does not require agreement. It does not ask for belief. It offers language for experiences many people already have, but rarely articulate. Overthinking that leads nowhere, decisions made without enough information, attention that fragments, emotion that masquerades as judgment, clarity that arrives briefly and then fades. There is no promise here of relief. Pressure may ease or it may not. Systems may soften or they may harden. This book does not speculate on that. It concerns itself with what remains possible regardless: the ability to think sufficiently well to avoid unnecessary harm, to preserve agency where it might otherwise erode, and to continue without becoming unrecognizable to oneself. If you are reading this in a moment of calm, some of what follows may feel obvious. If you are reading it under strain, it may feel familiar rather than enlightening. That familiarity is intentional. The purpose is not revelation, but recognition. Often, recognition is enough to interrupt distortion. This book does not end with answers because most of the questions it addresses do not close neatly. It ends with a posture, one that accepts pressure as real, limits as binding, and thinking as imperfect but still worth doing. If that posture helps you remain oriented when conditions tighten, then the book has done its work. Nothing more is required. Chapter 1. Pressure changes how we think. Pressure does not merely make thinking harder. It changes what thinking becomes. Under pressure, the mind does not operate at a lower resolution of the same process. It shifts into a different mode altogether. What feels like confusion, hesitation, or mental fatigue is often a structural reconfiguration rather than a personal failure. The mind under pressure is not lazy, weak, or defective. It is defensive. In ordinary conditions, thought unfolds with room to wander. Ideas can be held loosely, revised, discarded, returned to. Time allows error without immediate cost. Under pressure, this spaciousness collapses. Time shortens, stakes sharpen, attention narrows. The mind begins to behave less like an instrument of exploration and more like a mechanism of survival. It scans for threat before meaning, for exit before understanding, for certainty before truth. This shift is rarely noticed in the moment. Most people experience it only as an internal accusation. I'm not thinking clearly. But clarity is not simply lost, it is displaced by urgency. Under pressure, the mind prioritizes speed over accuracy, coherence over nuance, action over reflection. It becomes impatient with ambiguity and intolerant of complexity. Questions that once felt interesting now feel dangerous. Open-ended thinking starts to resemble delay, and delay starts to resemble risk. What makes pressure especially corrosive is that it interferes with thinking while convincing us that we are thinking more. Mental activity increases, rehearsing scenarios, replaying conversations, anticipating outcomes, but this activity is circular rather than generative. The mind turns inward on a small set of concerns, grinding them repeatedly, mistaking motion for progress. This is why pressure so often produces overthinking without insight. The volume of thought rises while its range contracts. Another quiet effect of pressure is its distortion of memory. Under strain, the mind privileges recent events, emotionally charged moments, and perceived failures. Long-term perspective fades. Past successes lose their stabilizing power. The future becomes either a threat or a vague abstraction. Decisions are no longer made in the context of a life or a trajectory, but in the shadow of the next consequence. The horizon shrinks until everything feels immediate and personal. Pressure also changes the relationship between thought and emotion. In calm conditions, emotion can inform judgment without dominating it. Under pressure, emotion moves closer to the steering wheel. Fear becomes persuasive. Resentment feels like clarity. Hope disguises itself as realism. The mind does not merely feel these emotions, it begins to think in their language. What appears as reasoning is often emotional momentum dressed in logic. This is why intelligent, experienced people sometimes make decisions under pressure that puzzle them later. They did not suddenly become less capable. They were operating under a different internal regime. Pressure rewards decisiveness, not reflection. It favors familiar patterns over careful evaluation. It pushes the mind toward what has worked before, even if the present situation no longer matches the past. In this way, pressure quietly converts experience into rigidity. Modern life multiplies these effects. Many environments now maintain a constant low-grade pressure. Deadlines, surveillance, financial uncertainty, social comparison, informational overload. The mind rarely returns to a true baseline. Instead, it hovers in a semi-pressurized state, alert but fatigued, responsive but shallow. In such conditions, people often believe they are failing at thinking, when in fact they are being continuously pushed into a mode that was never meant to be permanent. Understanding this is not about excusing poor decisions or surrendering agency. It is about regaining orientation. When you recognize that pressure reshapes cognition, you stop treating mental strain as a personal defect and start seeing it as an environmental force. You begin to distinguish between thoughts that arise from clarity and those that arise from compression. You learn to ask not only what am I thinking, but under what conditions is this thinking occurring? This distinction matters. A mind under pressure will always feel urgent, certain, and narrow. A mind with space will feel slower, less dramatic, and often more uncertain at first. Many people distrust the latter because it lacks the adrenaline of crisis. Yet it is precisely in that quieter mode that judgment recovers its range. Pressure is not going away. Scarcity, uncertainty, and constraint are features of the world, not anomalies. The question is not how to eliminate pressure, but how to think without being owned by it. The chapters that follow are not about becoming smarter, faster, or more confident. They are about learning to recognize when pressure has taken the wheel and how to reclaim enough space inside the mind to decide without distortion. That reclamation begins with a simple acknowledgement. When everything feels urgent, thinking changes. And when thinking changes, the first task is not to push harder, but to see clearly what pressure is already doing. Chapter 2. Decision-making without enough information. Most decisions that matter are made without sufficient information. This is not a flaw in modern life, nor a temporary condition caused by chaos or incompetence. It is the default state. The expectation that clarity precedes action is largely a cultural fiction, reinforced by stories told after outcomes are known. In real time, information is partial, signals conflict, and consequences are opaque. Waiting for completeness is often indistinguishable from refusing to decide. Under pressure, this gap becomes more visible and more painful. The mind wants closure. It wants confirmation, reassurance, and a clear path that removes risk rather than redistributes it. When those things are unavailable, decision-making can stall. People call this hesitation prudence, or caution, or careful thinking, but often it is something simpler. An attempt to avoid responsibility by postponing commitment. The difficulty is not that information is missing. The difficulty is that the mind treats missing information as a temporary problem rather than a permanent condition. It assumes that with one more data point, one more conversation, one more night of thinking, certainty will arrive. This belief keeps people suspended between options long after the cost of delay exceeds the cost of error. Under pressure, delay rarely preserves safety. It merely transfers risk to time. When information is incomplete, the mind reaches for substitutes. One substitute is authority. Another is consensus. A third is past experience applied mechanically to new circumstances. These shortcuts can be useful, but they are often mistaken for thinking itself. In environments where uncertainty is chronic, people learn to disguise deference or habit as judgment. Decisions appear rational while being largely unexamined. Another common response to insufficient information is narrative construction. The mind fills gaps by creating a story that feels coherent enough to act upon. This story may not be accurate, but it provides emotional relief. It turns ambiguity into direction. Under pressure, such narratives harden quickly. Once a story has allowed action, questioning it feels like reopening danger. This is how early assumptions quietly become dogma. What distinguishes functional decision-making under uncertainty is not confidence, but containment. Instead of seeking certainty, the mind learns to limit the scope of the decision. Rather than asking, "What is the right choice?" it asks, "What choice keeps future options open?" This is a different orientation. It accepts that error is likely, but aims to make error survivable. The goal shifts from correctness to recoverability. This shift requires letting go of a subtle but powerful illusion that decisions must resolve situations. Many decisions do not resolve anything. They simply move you to a different position from which new information becomes available. Under pressure, this feels unsatisfying. The mind wants resolution, not movement. But movement is often the only way clarity arrives. People who cope well with uncertainty tend to rely on simple internal criteria rather than exhaustive analysis. They pay attention to asymmetry. Which option has irreversible consequences, which does not? They notice fragility. Which choice fails catastrophically if wrong, which fails gradually? They consider alignment. Which action they can live with if outcomes turn against them? These are not calculations of probability, but assessments of exposure. There is also an emotional discipline involved. Uncertainty amplifies anxiety, and anxiety seeks discharge. Decisions made primarily to relieve discomfort often feel urgent and justified, yet produce regret later. Learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing is therefore not a psychological luxury, but a cognitive necessity. It creates a buffer between pressure and action, allowing judgment to operate at all. Modern systems rarely reward this kind of thinking. They prefer decisiveness that looks confident and speed that looks competent. As a result, people are trained to perform certainty even when none exists. Over time, this performance becomes internalized. The mind confuses decisiveness with correctness and hesitation with weakness. In such environments, admitting uncertainty feels like exposure. Yet uncertainty does not disappear when ignored. It simply reasserts itself later, often with greater force. Decisions made under the illusion of certainty tend to be brittle. They work only if reality cooperates. Decisions made with uncertainty acknowledged tend to be flexible. They assume adjustment will be necessary and leave room for it. To decide without enough information is not to abandon thinking, but to redefine it. It is to accept that judgment operates under constraint, not ideal conditions. It is to trade the comfort of imagined certainty for the resilience of adaptive action. This does not make decisions easier. It makes them honest. Pressure will always push the mind toward premature closure. Recognizing this pressure does not eliminate it, but it changes how its influence is interpreted. The task is not to outthink uncertainty, but to move through it without becoming rigid or reckless. In the absence of full information, the quality of a decision lies less in its outcome than in how well it preserves the capacity to respond when reality reveals what thinking alone could not. Chapter 3. Overthinking versus action. Overthinking is often mistaken for depth. It presents itself as diligence, responsibility, even intelligence. The mind stays busy, engaged, alert. It revisits the same questions from multiple angles, searching for the one formulation that will finally unlock certainty. From the inside, this activity feels productive. From the outside, it often looks like paralysis. The distinction between thinking and overthinking is not the amount of mental effort involved, but its direction. Thinking moves outward. It tests ideas against reality, updates itself through feedback, and changes shape as conditions change. Overthinking moves inward. It recycles the same material, refining arguments that never leave the mind, and preparing defenses against outcomes that have not yet occurred. One generates contact with the world, the other avoids it. Pressure intensifies this inward turn. When action feels risky, the mind compensates by increasing rehearsal. Scenarios multiply. Conversations are imagined and reimagined. Possible futures branch endlessly. Each iteration feels like preparation, but nothing is exposed to correction. Without external friction, thought loses calibration. It becomes self-referential, convincing, and increasingly detached from actual constraints. What makes overthinking especially deceptive is that it often arises from conscientiousness. People who care about consequences, who want to avoid harm or failure, are more likely to overthink. The mind treats action as morally loaded. Choosing feels like taking responsibility for everything that follows. In response, it delays, hoping to reduce moral weight through better reasoning. But delay rarely neutralizes responsibility. It merely shifts it. Another source of overthinking is the fear of irreversibility. Some actions cannot be undone, and the mind responds by demanding absolute justification before proceeding. In practice, this standard is almost never met. The result is a kind of internal stalemate, where action is postponed indefinitely while circumstances continue to evolve. Overthinking, in this sense, is not indecision. It is an attempt to stop time. Action, by contrast, does not require certainty. It requires alignment. An action can be tentative, reversible, or provisional. It can be taken with the explicit understanding that it may need to be corrected. What distinguishes action from impulsivity is not confidence, but proportionality. The action matches the information available. It does not pretend to solve the entire problem when only part of it is visible. One useful way to tell whether thinking has crossed into overthinking is to ask whether it is producing new distinctions. Genuine thinking clarifies. It separates what matters from what does not. Overthinking blurs. It treats all variables as equally important, all risks as equally threatening. The mind becomes crowded, not sharper. When every option feels heavy, it is often because thought has lost its hierarchy. Overthinking also thrives on imagined audiences. Decisions are rehearsed not only for their outcomes, but for how they will be judged. Internal dialogue fills with explanations addressed to absent critics, supervisors, partners, family members, imagined versions of oneself in the future. Action is postponed until a narrative can be constructed that feels defensible from all angles. This is rarely possible. The imagined audience keeps growing. In contrast, action under pressure often feels unsatisfying. It lacks the sense of intellectual completion that overthinking provides. It may feel crude, partial, even reckless. Yet action has a quality that thought alone cannot replicate: exposure. Once an action is taken, reality responds. Feedback arrives, sometimes harshly, sometimes subtly. The mind regains traction because it is no longer operating in a closed loop. This does not mean that action should replace thinking, or that speed should be valued over reflection. The danger lies in mistaking internal activity for engagement with reality. Thinking that does not change behavior, position, or understanding is often a signal that fear has found a respectable disguise. Under sustained pressure, many people develop a habit of overthinking as a form of self-protection. It keeps them occupied, gives the impression of control, and postpones the moment of exposure. But over time, this habit becomes costly. Energy is consumed without producing movement. Confidence erodes as decisions remain hypothetical. The mind grows tired of carrying possibilities that never resolve. The alternative is not to act blindly, but to redefine what action means. Action does not have to be decisive or dramatic. It can be as simple as choosing a next step that creates information. It can be limited in scope, time-bound, and reversible. What matters is that it breaks the isolation of the mind and reintroduces contact with the world. In pressured environments, the question is rarely whether to think or to act. It is whether thinking is still serving orientation, or whether it has become a shelter from risk. When thought ceases to generate movement, it quietly changes sides. It stops being a tool of judgment and becomes a mechanism of avoidance. Recognizing this shift is not a call to abandon reflection, but to restore balance. Thought earns its place when it sharpens action, not when it replaces it. Under pressure, the mind must learn when to stop circling and step forward, not because the path is clear, but because remaining still has become its own form of danger. Chapter 4. Attention under load. Attention is the first faculty to degrade under pressure, yet it is often the last one people notice failing. This is because attention does not collapse dramatically. It fragments, it thins, it slips from deliberate focus into reactive scanning. The mind remains busy, alert, even vigilant, but it no longer stays with anything long enough to understand it fully. Under load, attention becomes restless. In calm conditions, attention can be directed. It can linger, return, and deepen. Under pressure, it becomes defensive. The mind begins to treat the environment as a field of potential threats and opportunities that must be continuously monitored. Focus narrows to what seems immediately relevant, while everything else fades into the background. This narrowing feels efficient, even necessary, but it carries a hidden cost. Context is lost. What makes attentional overload especially damaging is that it disguises itself as engagement. People under pressure often feel more on, more alert, more mentally active. In reality, their attention is being pulled apart by competing demands. Interruptions multiply, signals overlap. The mind jumps from one concern to another, never fully disengaging, never fully committing. Depth is replaced by vigilance. Modern environments amplify this effect. Notifications, metrics, surveillance, and constant updates train attention to respond rather than choose. The mind adapts by developing a habit of partial focus. It becomes accustomed to holding several things loosely at once, believing this to be flexibility. Over time, this habit erodes the capacity for sustained thought. Concentration begins to feel unnatural, even uncomfortable, while distraction feels normal. Under pressure, attention also becomes biased. The mind gravitates towards stimuli that carry emotional charge, conflict, threat, validation, loss. Neutral or ambiguous information is ignored. This bias distorts judgment, not by introducing false information, but by excluding relevant information. Decisions made under attentional bias often feel justified, yet later appear strangely incomplete. Important details were present, but they never entered awareness. Another subtle effect of attentional load is the loss of sequencing. The mind struggles to distinguish what must be addressed now from what can wait. Everything feels urgent. As a result, attention flattens priorities. Time-sensitive issues crowd out strategic ones. Immediate relief is favored over long-term orientation. The mind reacts quickly, but plans poorly. People often respond to this state by trying to force focus. They apply effort, discipline, and self-criticism. But attention cannot be commanded when it is already exhausted. Force increases strain without restoring clarity. The more the mind is pushed to attend, the more it resists, slipping into avoidance or fixation. What restores attention under load is not intensity, but containment. Attention stabilizes when the field of concern is deliberately narrowed. This does not mean ignoring reality, but selecting a smaller portion of it to engage with fully. Under pressure, trying to attend to everything guarantees superficiality. Choosing what to attend to is therefore an act of judgment, not negligence. There is also a temporal dimension to attention that pressure disrupts. Sustained focus requires a sense that time is available. When time feels scarce, attention becomes brittle. Even brief interruptions feel costly. The mind rushes, not because speed is required, but because it fears running out of room. Restoring attention often involves creating pockets of psychological time, moments where nothing else is being evaluated or decided. It is important to distinguish between alertness and attention. Alertness is a state of readiness. Attention is a relationship. Under pressure, alertness increases while attention weakens. People feel awake but unfocused, stimulated but shallow. This mismatch leads to frustration and self-blame. Recognizing the difference allows for a more accurate diagnosis. The problem is not laziness or lack of will, but a nervous system operating under sustained demand. Attention under load does not disappear. It scatters. The task is not to gather it all back at once, but to anchor it deliberately. When attention is given a stable object, one problem, one text, one task, it begins to recover its coherence. The mind remembers how to stay. In pressured conditions, the quality of thinking is inseparable from the quality of attention. When attention is fragmented, thought becomes brittle. When attention is contained, thought regains depth. This is not a matter of technique or optimization, but of recognizing limits. The mind can attend well to a small field or poorly to a large one. Under load, choosing the field matters more than trying harder. As pressure persists, attention will always be contested. The goal is not to eliminate distraction, but to prevent attention from dissolving entirely into reactivity. Clarity begins not with better ideas, but with the quiet decision to stay with one thing long enough for it to reveal its structure. Chapter 5. Emotional Interference. Emotions do not interrupt thinking from the outside. They operate from within it. Under pressure, this interference becomes harder to detect because emotion does not announce itself as feeling. It presents itself as judgment. What feels like a conclusion is often an affective state that is already decided and is now recruiting reasons to justify itself. In stable conditions, emotion and thought can remain loosely coupled. Feelings arise, are noticed, and inform judgment without overwhelming it. Under pressure, the boundary erodes. Emotion moves closer to the center of decision-making, not because people become irrational, but because emotion carries information about threat, loss, and urgency. The mind treats this information as time-sensitive. It listens more closely. Fear is the most obvious example. Under pressure, fear sharpens attention and accelerates decision-making. It narrows options to those that promise immediate safety. This can be adaptive in acute danger. In prolonged uncertainty, however, fear becomes a poor guide. It exaggerates risk, compresses time horizons, and favors defensive action, even when defense creates longer-term vulnerability. The mind feels decisive, but its field of vision has already contracted. Resentment interferes differently. It introduces a moral dimension into judgment. Situations are no longer evaluated solely for their practical consequences, but for what they signify about fairness, recognition, or respect. Decisions shaped by resentment often feel justified, even principled, yet they are reactive. They aim to correct a perceived imbalance rather than navigate reality as it is. Under pressure, resentment can masquerade as clarity. Hope, too, distorts thinking. When options are limited and outcomes uncertain, hope fills the gap with imagined resolution. It softens risk and inflates probability. The mind leans toward interpretations that preserve optimism, sometimes ignoring contradictory signals. Hope-driven decisions feel humane and forward-looking, but they can become forms of denial when not anchored in constraint. Under pressure, hope can delay necessary reckoning. Another subtle form of emotional interference is fatigue. Exhaustion does not merely reduce energy, it alters evaluation. The mind begins to favor options that promise relief over those that offer advantage. Short-term comfort outweighs long-term consequence. Decisions made in this state often surprise people later, not because they were foolish, but because the criteria had shifted without awareness. Fatigue quietly lowers the bar. Emotional interference is especially difficult to manage because it often feels like authenticity. Acting from the gut is culturally valorized as honesty and courage. In reality, the gut is an interpreter, not an oracle. It reacts quickly to patterns learned in other contexts, under other conditions. Under pressure, these reactions may be outdated or misaligned. Treating them as truth rather than signal increases distortion. The problem is not that emotion influences thinking, but that it does so invisibly. People rarely say, I am deciding this because I am afraid, or because I am angry, or because I am tired. Instead, they say, this makes sense, or this is obvious, or there's no other option. Emotion supplies certainty, and certainty silences doubt. What restores balance is not suppression of emotion, but differentiation. The mind must learn to recognize when an emotion is informing judgment and when it is commandeering it. This requires slowing down just enough to notice tone. Thoughts driven by emotional interference often carry a particular texture: urgency, moral weight, finality. They resist reconsideration. They feel complete. Creating space between feeling and conclusion allows judgment to re-enter. This space does not eliminate emotion, it contextualizes it. Fear becomes one input among others. Resentment becomes a signal rather than a verdict. Hope becomes a possibility rather than a plan. Fatigue becomes a condition to account for, not a command to obey. In pressured environments, emotional interference is unavoidable. The aim is not emotional neutrality, but emotional literacy. When the mind can name what it is feeling, it gains leverage. When it cannot, emotion dictates terms while pretending to be reason. Clear thinking under pressure depends less on emotional strength than on emotional visibility. The moment an emotion is seen as a factor rather than a fact, its influence weakens. Judgment regains degrees of freedom. Decisions become less reactive, less brittle, and more proportionate to the reality they must face. Emotion will always be present in thinking. Under pressure, it becomes louder. The task is not to silence it, but to prevent it from speaking in the voice of inevitability. Chapter 6. Cognitive Bias in Daily Life. Cognitive bias is often discussed as a catalog of named errors, a list of tendencies to be memorized and avoided. In practice, this framing is misleading. Under pressure, bias is not an occasional distortion layered onto otherwise neutral thinking. It is the default shape thinking takes when time, energy, and information are constrained. Bias is not a flaw added to judgment. It is the mind's method of coping with complexity when full deliberation is impossible. In daily life, biases do not announce themselves as mistakes. They feel like efficiency. They allow the mind to reach conclusions quickly, to reduce ambiguity, and to act without becoming overwhelmed. Under calm conditions, this efficiency is often harmless. Under pressure, the same shortcuts harden into blind spots. The mind begins to treat its first interpretation as reality rather than as one hypothesis among others. One of the most pervasive biases under pressure is confirmation. Once the mind forms an initial impression, it selectively notices information that supports it and discounts information that complicates it. This process is largely unconscious. People do not feel as though they are ignoring evidence. They feel as though the evidence is obvious. Under pressure, confirmation bias accelerates because revising beliefs feels costly. It requires reopening uncertainty, which the mind is already struggling to contain. Another daily bias amplified by pressure is attribution. People explain outcomes by locating causes in character rather than context. Success becomes a sign of competence. Failure becomes a sign of deficiency. Under pressure, this bias simplifies social reality. It reduces complex systems to individual intentions, making the world easier to judge but harder to understand. Decisions based on attribution bias often feel decisive and morally clear, yet they misread the forces actually at work. Availability bias also plays a quiet but powerful role. The mind overweights information that is recent, vivid, or emotionally charged. What comes easily to mind feels representative. Under pressure, this bias intensifies because attention has already narrowed. Rare events that are dramatic loom larger than common events that are mundane. Risk assessment becomes distorted, not through ignorance, but through salience. There is also a bias toward coherence. The mind prefers explanations that form a smooth, unified story. Contradictions feel intolerable. Under pressure, this preference strengthens. People discard inconvenient facts not because they are false, but because they disrupt narrative flow. Decisions made within overly coherent stories tend to be brittle. They depend on reality continuing to behave in ways that support the story. Perhaps the most dangerous bias under pressure is escalation of commitment. Once energy, identity, or reputation has been invested in a course of action, the mind resists reevaluation. Evidence that suggests change is interpreted as noise or threat. Under pressure, backing away feels like loss. Continuing feels like resolve. The line between perseverance and entrapment blurs. What makes cognitive bias difficult to address in daily life is that awareness alone is insufficient. Knowing that biases exist does not prevent them from operating. Under pressure, the mind does not consult theory. It relies on habits. Biases are habits of interpretation, learned through repetition and reinforced by outcome. They operate fastest where reflection is slowest. The practical task, then, is not to eliminate bias, but to recognize which biases are most active under pressure and how they shape judgment. This requires noticing patterns rather than policing individual thoughts. When interpretations become rigid, when alternatives feel irrelevant, when doubt feels dangerous, bias is likely at work. These are structural signals, not intellectual failures. Another useful distinction is between reversible and irreversible decisions. Bias is most costly when it locks the mind into paths that cannot be easily adjusted. Under pressure, people often commit fully before testing assumptions. They collapse experimentation into commitment. This magnifies the consequences of bias. Decisions that preserve reversibility limit the damage bias can do. Bias thrives in isolation. When thinking remains internal, shortcuts go unchallenged. Contact with reality, through action, feedback, or exposure to consequences, interrupts bias by introducing friction. This does not guarantee correctness, but it restores calibration. Bias loses power when interpretations are forced to meet resistance. In daily life, cognitive bias is not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be managed. Under pressure, the mind will simplify. It will categorize, infer, and conclude with limited data. The question is whether these conclusions are treated as provisional or final. When bias is mistaken for truth, judgment ossifies. When bias is recognized as a temporary scaffold, thinking remains flexible. Clear thinking under pressure does not require purity of mind. It requires humility about how the mind works when strained. Bias is not a sign that thinking has failed. It is a sign that thinking is operating under load. The work is not to remove bias entirely, but to prevent it from quietly becoming destiny. Chapter 7. Pattern Recognition versus Noise. Under pressure, the mind becomes hungry for patterns. It searches for coherence in fragments, for signals that reduce uncertainty, for structures that promise prediction. This impulse is not misguided. Pattern recognition is one of the mind's most powerful tools. It allows experience to accumulate, lessons to transfer, and judgment to operate faster than deliberate analysis ever could. But under strain, the same mechanism that detects meaning also manufactures it. The difficulty lies in distinguishing genuine pattern from noise. In stable environments, feedback is relatively clean. Actions produce outcomes that can be observed, compared, and refined over time. Under pressure, feedback becomes distorted. Outcomes are delayed, confounded by multiple variables, or influenced by forces outside one's control. The mind, still seeking orientation, begins to infer patterns from insufficient or ambiguous data. What feels like intuition in these moments is often compression. The mind collapses complexity into a single explanatory thread. This thread may be partially true, but it is rarely complete. Under pressure, partial truths gain disproportionate authority because they offer relief. They reduce the burden of not knowing. Once a pattern is accepted, attention reorganizes around it. Evidence that fits is noticed. Evidence that does not is dismissed as anomaly. Noise is especially convincing when it repeats. Random events cluster. Coincidences accumulate. The mind interprets recurrence as significance. In pressured environments, where similar stressors recur daily, this effect intensifies. People begin to read intention into routine variation, strategy into coincidence, hostility into indifference. Pattern recognition slides into pattern projection. There is also a social dimension to this process. Patterns are often shared. Groups converge on explanations that feel plausible and emotionally satisfying. These shared patterns stabilize collective behavior, but they also amplify error. Once a narrative becomes communal, questioning it carries social cost. Under pressure, conformity masquerades as insight. True pattern recognition differs from noise not by certainty, but by robustness. A genuine pattern remains meaningful across contexts. It explains variation rather than eliminating it. It accommodates exceptions without collapsing. Under pressure, however, the mind prefers patterns that are simple and decisive. Complexity feels like weakness. Ambiguity feels like danger. As a result, fragile patterns are favored over resilient ones. Another way noise infiltrates judgment is through over-attribution of agency. The mind assumes that outcomes are the result of deliberate design rather than systemic interaction or chance. Under pressure, this assumption simplifies causality. It creates villains, architects, and intentions where there may be none. This makes the world feel more legible, but less accurate. Pattern recognition also interacts with emotion. Fear sharpens the search for threat patterns. Resentment sharpens the search for injustice. Hope sharpens the search for opportunity. Each emotional state tunes the mind to a different frequency. Under pressure, this tuning becomes narrow. The mind detects patterns that align with its dominant emotion and misses others entirely. The cost of mistaking noise for pattern is not only error, but rigidity. Once a pattern is believed, it organizes future perception. The mind becomes less curious and more interpretive. New information is filtered through the existing frame rather than evaluated on its own terms. Adaptation slows. The world appears predictable until it suddenly is not. What preserves discernment under pressure is not skepticism in the abstract, but restraint in inference. This means holding patterns lightly, treating them as working hypotheses rather than conclusions, allowing them to guide attention without allowing them to dictate belief. This posture is uncomfortable because it keeps uncertainty alive, but it prevents premature closure. Another stabilizing factor is time. Patterns reveal themselves through duration, not intensity. Under pressure, intense moments dominate awareness. Quiet counterexamples are overlooked. Deliberately widening the temporal lens, asking how often something truly occurs, how long it persists, how it behaves under different conditions, helps separate signal from noise. Pattern recognition is indispensable. Without it, thinking remains slow and reactive. But under pressure, its strength becomes its vulnerability. The mind's capacity to see structure outruns the environment's capacity to provide reliable data. The result is overconfidence built on thin evidence. Clear thinking does not require abandoning intuition. It requires disciplining it. When patterns are treated as provisional maps rather than territories, they remain useful. When they are treated as reality itself, they quietly replace observation with belief. In pressured conditions, the task is not to stop seeing patterns, but to remain aware of how eagerly the mind wants them. Between chaos and certainty lies a narrower path, one where patterns guide action without imprisoning judgment, and where noise is tolerated long enough for genuine structure to emerge. Chapter 8. Information Overload. Information overload is often described as a modern inconvenience, a byproduct of abundance that can be solved through better filtering or discipline. Under pressure, however, information overload is not merely a matter of volume. It is a structural mismatch between the amount of input the mind receives and the amount of meaning it can process while under strain. The problem is not that there is too much to know, but that knowing more no longer improves judgment. In pressured conditions, the mind's capacity to integrate information shrinks, attention narrows, working memory tightens, and the tolerance for ambiguity drops. Yet information continues to arrive at the same pace, or faster. The result is not confusion in the obvious sense, but saturation. Signals blur together. Distinctions flatten. The mind begins to treat all input as equally urgent or equally disposable. One consequence of overload is the erosion of priority. When everything is presented as relevant, nothing is clearly important. The mind responds by oscillating, shifting focus from one piece of information to another without settling long enough to evaluate any of it properly. This creates the sensation of constant engagement without progress. People feel informed but not oriented, busy but not directed. Under pressure, information also takes on an emotional charge. News, messages, metrics, and updates are no longer neutral data. They are interpreted as threats, demands, or judgments. Each new input carries the possibility of consequence. The nervous system reacts accordingly. The mind becomes hypervigilant, scanning for danger rather than understanding. In this state, more information does not reduce uncertainty, it amplifies it. Another subtle effect of overload is the collapse of hierarchy. In a healthy cognitive environment, information is arranged by relevance and reliability. Under pressure, this hierarchy breaks down. Immediate inputs crowd out foundational ones. Recent events outweigh long-term patterns. Opinions travel faster than facts. The mind loses its internal structure and becomes reactive to whatever is most available. Information overload also encourages premature synthesis. Faced with too much input, the mind rushes to conclusions in order to regain a sense of coherence. These conclusions are often shallow, stitched together from incomplete fragments. They feel decisive, but they lack depth. Under pressure, synthesis becomes a coping mechanism rather than a thoughtful process. Modern systems exacerbate this dynamic by rewarding responsiveness. Speed of reaction is often mistaken for competence. People are praised for staying on top of things, which frequently means staying exposed to everything. Over time, this trains the mind to remain open to constant input, even when it undermines judgment. Withdrawal feels like negligence. Silence feels risky. What is often overlooked is that clarity does not scale with information. Beyond a certain threshold, additional input produces diminishing returns. Under pressure, that threshold is lower than people expect. The mind requires periods of relative quiet to integrate what it already has. Without these pauses, information accumulates without becoming understanding. The instinctive response to overload is usually more effort, tighter filters, stricter rules, increased vigilance. While some filtering is necessary, effort alone cannot solve a structural mismatch. What restores clarity is not processing everything more efficiently, but deciding what not to process at all. This is not ignorance, it is selection. Selection, under pressure, becomes a form of thinking. Choosing which information to ignore is as important as choosing which to attend to. This choice cannot be delegated entirely to external tools or algorithms because relevance is situational and personal. It requires judgment about what actually influences outcomes and what merely creates noise. Another important distinction is between information that guides action and information that satisfies curiosity or anxiety. Under pressure, these categories blur. The mind consumes data not to decide, but to reassure itself that it is not missing something critical. This creates a feedback loop. The more anxious the mind becomes, the more information it seeks, and the less clarity it gains. Breaking this loop involves accepting that some ignorance is unavoidable and even necessary. No decision is made with total awareness. Attempting to approximate omniscience under pressure only deepens confusion. Clarity emerges not from knowing everything, but from knowing enough to act and being willing to adjust when reality responds. Information overload, like other cognitive strains under pressure, is not a personal failure. It is an environmental condition interacting with finite mental resources. Recognizing this shifts the task from self-criticism to design, shaping the informational environment so that thinking can occur at all. Under pressure, the most valuable information is often already present but obscured by excess. Reducing input does not simplify reality, it restores proportion. When the mind is no longer drowning in signals, it regains the ability to distinguish what matters from what merely insists on attention. Chapter 9. Clarity versus intelligence. Intelligence is often treated as a stable trait, something a person possesses and can draw upon at will. Clarity is different. It is a state, not a capacity, and it is far more sensitive to conditions. Under pressure, this difference becomes visible. Highly intelligent people can think in ways that are complex, nuanced, and internally consistent, yet still lack clarity. Less intellectually agile people can sometimes see a situation more clearly simply because their thinking is less crowded. Clarity is not about having more thoughts. It is about having fewer, better aligned ones. Under pressure, intelligence tends to multiply possibilities. It generates alternatives, counterarguments, contingencies. This expansion can be useful in open environments, but in constrained ones, it often becomes a liability. The mind fills with options that cannot all be acted upon, evaluated, or even held simultaneously. Intelligence accelerates, but orientation weakens. One reason clarity is lost under pressure is that intelligence is often recruited to defend positions rather than to examine them. The more capable the mind, the more effectively it can justify almost any conclusion once it has been reached. Under strain, conclusions are often formed early, driven by emotion, habit, or circumstance. Intelligence then enters as an advocate rather than a judge. The result feels convincing, but it is brittle. Clarity, by contrast, is modest. It does not attempt to account for everything. It identifies what matters most and lets the rest remain unresolved. This restraint can feel unsophisticated, even crude, especially to those accustomed to complex analysis. Yet under pressure, clarity preserves function. It keeps thinking aligned with action and action aligned with reality. Another difference between clarity and intelligence lies in their relationship to uncertainty. Intelligence often treats uncertainty as a problem to be solved. It searches for hidden variables, missing information, deeper explanations. Under pressure, this search can become endless. Clarity treats uncertainty as a boundary. It acknowledges what cannot be known in time and works within that limit. This does not reduce risk, but it prevents the paralysis that comes from demanding impossible precision. Clarity is also more closely tied to perspective. It requires the ability to step back from the immediate frame and see how a decision fits into a larger pattern of consequences. Under pressure, intelligence tends to zoom in. It focuses on details, arguments, and edge cases. Clarity zooms out just enough to restore proportion. It asks which aspects of the situation are durable and which are transient, which costs are acceptable and which are not. In many environments, intelligence is rewarded more visibly than clarity. Intelligent people can speak fluently, analyze impressively, and respond quickly. Clarity often expresses itself through hesitation, simplification, or silence. It may look like lack of engagement or lack of insight. Under pressure, this creates a perverse dynamic. Those who see most clearly may speak least, while those who speak most confidently may be least oriented. Clarity also has an emotional component. It requires a certain calm, or at least a reduction in internal noise. When the mind is crowded with fear, resentment, or urgency, intelligence becomes reactive. It chases solutions that promise relief rather than alignment. Clarity emerges only when emotional interference is contained enough to allow discrimination between what feels important and what actually is. It is worth noting that clarity cannot be forced. It does not arise from effort alone. Pushing the mind to be clearer under pressure often produces the opposite effect. Clarity arrives when unnecessary complexity is released, when attention is narrowed deliberately, and when the demand to be right is replaced by the need to be oriented. This is why clarity often appears late, after a period of confusion or overload. It is not the result of accumulating more insight, but of shedding excess. Under pressure, shedding is harder than accumulating. Letting go of options, interpretations, and imagined futures feels like loss. Yet without this pruning, thought remains tangled. The distinction between clarity and intelligence matters because pressure rewards different qualities than comfort. In calm conditions, intelligence can roam. In pressured ones, clarity sustains movement. Decisions do not require brilliance, they require coherence. They require knowing enough to act and being prepared to adjust when reality answers back. Clarity does not guarantee success, but it reduces self-inflicted harm. It prevents the mind from becoming its own obstacle. Under pressure, this is no small thing. Many failures attributed to lack of ability are, in fact, failures of clarity. The mind knew too much, considered too much, and moved too little. In the end, intelligence remains valuable, but it must be subordinated to clarity when conditions tighten. When time, energy, and certainty are limited, the goal is not to think better than everyone else, but to think clearly enough to remain oriented. Under pressure, that is the quieter, rarer skill, and often the decisive one. Chapter 10. A working model for pressure. A working model is not a theory of everything. It does not aim to explain the world or resolve complexity once and for all. Its purpose is more modest and more practical, to provide orientation when conditions are compressed and thinking is under strain. Under pressure, elaborate frameworks collapse under their own weight. What remains useful is something small enough to carry, simple enough to remember, and flexible enough to adapt. The first element of such a model is recognizing the condition itself. Pressure distorts perception before it distorts judgment. When time feels scarce, stakes feel high, and attention feels fragmented, the mind is already operating under load. Naming this condition matters because it prevents misattribution. Instead of interpreting mental strain as personal inadequacy, it is understood as an environmental effect. This reframing does not remove pressure, but it prevents it from silently defining the rules. The second element is containment. Under pressure, the mind tends to expand problems rather than limit them. It tries to solve too much at once, collapsing multiple decisions into a single moment. A working model deliberately narrows the field. It asks what must be decided now and what can be deferred. It accepts that not all variables will be addressed. Containment is not avoidance, it is boundary setting for thought. The third element is reversibility. Decisions under pressure are rarely optimal, but they can be survivable. A working model privileges actions that preserve the ability to adjust. It distinguishes between choices that close doors and those that leave them ajar. This does not guarantee safety, but it limits exposure. When reversibility is preserved, error becomes information rather than catastrophe. The fourth element is emotional accounting. Feelings are not excluded from the model. They are acknowledged as forces. Fear, resentment, hope, and fatigue are treated as conditions influencing judgment, not as verdicts. The model asks not whether an emotion is justified, but how it is shaping perception. This creates distance without denial. Emotion remains present, but it no longer speaks with absolute authority. The fifth element is temporal grounding. Pressure compresses time, making everything feel immediate and final. A working model resists this compression by reintroducing sequence. It treats decisions as steps rather than endpoints. This restores movement. When time is perceived as a series of positions rather than a single cliff edge, thinking regains elasticity. The final element is acceptance of imperfection. Under pressure, the desire to be correct often overrides the need to be oriented. A working model replaces the pursuit of correctness with the pursuit of coherence. It asks whether a decision aligns with constraints, values, and capacity, rather than whether it guarantees success. This shift reduces self-blame and preserves agency. Together, these elements form a posture rather than a procedure. They do not eliminate uncertainty or neutralize risk. They provide a way to stand inside pressure without being folded by it. The model does not promise clarity at all times. It promises recoverability when clarity fails. What makes this model workable is its humility. It does not assume that thinking can master conditions. It assumes that conditions will often overwhelm thinking. The aim is not control, but navigation. Under pressure, navigation is enough. As environments become more demanding, more surveilled, and more volatile, pressure will increasingly define how people think. Those who wait for ideal conditions will remain stalled. Those who mistake urgency for clarity will move quickly and break quietly. Those who carry a simple, adaptable model will not always succeed, but they will remain oriented. Thinking under pressure is not about becoming harder, faster, or more decisive. It is about staying intact. When the mind can recognize pressure, contain scope, preserve reversibility, account for emotion, ground itself in time, and accept imperfection, it retains the capacity to respond. That capacity, quiet, unglamorous, and durable, is what allows thinking to continue when conditions insist that it should collapse. This is not mastery. It is sufficiency. Under pressure, sufficiency is often the highest available form of clarity. Chapter 11. After pressure. Pressure leaves residue. Even when conditions ease, the mind does not immediately return to its earlier shape. Vigilance lingers. Attention remains tight. Decisions carry an echo of urgency long after urgency has passed. This is not a failure to relax. It is the cost of adaptation. Systems that have learned to survive strain do not stand down easily. After pressure, people often misread themselves. They expect relief to feel expansive, grateful, or calm. Instead, they feel flat, cautious, or strangely distant. The nervous system, having been trained to respond to demand, does not trust the absence of it. It waits for the next signal. In this interval, thinking can feel muted, as if clarity should arrive but does not. What is missing is not insight, but recalibration. One danger of this phase is overcorrection. Having endured constraint, the mind may swing toward excess, seeking stimulation, certainty, or release. Decisions made here can be reactive in a different direction, driven by the desire to prove that pressure no longer rules. This impulse is understandable. It is also risky. Recovery is not the same as reversal. Another danger is permanent contraction. Some people never reopen their field of thought after pressure lifts. They continue to think narrowly, defensively, long after the environment has changed. What was once adaptive becomes limiting. The world feels smaller not because it is, but because the mind has not yet learned that it can afford to widen again. The transition out of pressure is therefore not automatic. It requires attention of a different kind. The task is not to optimize or accelerate, but to notice which constraints are still real and which have become internal habits. This noticing is subtle. It often appears as boredom, restlessness, or impatience, signals that the mind has more capacity than it is currently using. Clarity after pressure returns unevenly. It comes in brief windows rather than sustained states. These windows are easy to miss because they lack drama. They feel ordinary. Yet they are important. They mark the mind's renewed ability to hold more than one possibility without urgency, to consider without defending, to pause without fear. Integration happens when the lessons of pressure are retained without preserving its posture. The aim is not to forget how to function under load, but to stop living as if load were permanent. Skills developed in constraint, containment, reversibility, emotional accounting remain valuable. They simply no longer need to dominate every decision. It is also worth acknowledging that some pressures do not fully lift. Many lives remain shaped by ongoing uncertainty, limited control, or structural constraint. In such cases, after pressure does not mean relief. It means adaptation stabilizes. The mind finds a rhythm within constraint. Thinking becomes quieter, not because demands have vanished, but because the relationship to them has changed. What endures is the posture learned under pressure, an orientation toward sufficiency rather than perfection, coherence rather than certainty, movement rather than resolution. This posture does not guarantee ease. It does, however, preserve agency. It allows the mind to respond without collapsing into urgency or retreating into avoidance. In the end, thinking under pressure is not a temporary technique, but a permanent competency. Conditions will tighten again. New constraints will appear. The value of a working model is not that it eliminates strain, but that it reduces the cost of returning to clarity when strain returns. After pressure, the quiet work is to notice that thinking has room again, and to let it use that room without suspicion. The mind does not need to be pushed back to health. It needs permission to expand. Chapter 12. Staying oriented. Orientation is not a moment of insight. It is a condition that must be maintained. Under pressure, people often imagine clarity as something that arrives, settles matters, and remains. In reality, orientation is provisional. It fades when conditions change, when fatigue accumulates, when new demands intrude. The work is not to achieve clarity once, but to return to it repeatedly. Staying oriented means recognizing early signs of drift. Drift does not announce itself as error. It announces itself as certainty without proportion. Thoughts become sharp but narrow. Judgments feel final too quickly. Alternatives feel irrelevant. When this happens, the mind is not failing. It is economizing. Pressure has increased, and thinking has tightened to match it. Orientation begins by noticing this tightening without panic. Another sign of drift is the substitution of reaction for judgment. Under load, Responsiveness is praised, and delay is penalized. Over time, this trains the mind to answer immediately, to move before it understands. Staying oriented requires preserving a small pause between stimulus and response. Not a long pause, not analysis, just enough space for discrimination. That pause is fragile. It must be protected deliberately. Orientation also depends on scale. Pressure collapses scale, making near-term consequences eclipse everything else. Staying oriented involves restoring proportion, distinguishing what is urgent from what is important, what is reversible from what is not, what is local from what is structural. This does not require comprehensive analysis. It requires asking the right question at the right altitude. Language plays a role here. Under pressure, language hardens. Words become absolute. Always, never, no choice, must. These terms create momentum, but they also conceal alternatives. Staying oriented involves softening language just enough to reopen possibility. Not to dilute commitment, but to prevent language from deciding on the mind's behalf. There is also a social dimension to orientation. Pressure isolates. It narrows the circle of consultation and increases reliance on internal rehearsal. Staying oriented does not mean seeking reassurance or consensus. It means maintaining at least one point of external contact with reality. This can be a conversation, an action, or a constraint that pushes back. Orientation requires friction. Importantly, staying oriented does not mean staying calm. Calm is intermittent and often unavailable. Orientation can exist alongside fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. It is not an emotional state, but a cognitive posture. When the posture is intact, decisions remain proportionate even when feelings are intense. As conditions continue to tighten in many domains of life, the ability to stay oriented becomes more valuable than brilliance. Systems reward speed, confidence, and output. They do not reliably reward judgment. Orientation, therefore, becomes a private discipline rather than a public performance. It is practiced quietly, often invisibly, and its benefits appear as avoided damage rather than visible success. The aim of thinking under pressure is not to become invulnerable. It is to remain navigable, to make choices that can be revised, to act without surrendering perspective, to endure without hardening into rigidity. When orientation is preserved, pressure remains a condition to be managed, not an identity to be adopted. This is not a promise of relief. It is a promise of continuity. When thinking stays oriented, it can return to itself after disruption. It can widen when space appears, and narrow when constraint demands it. It does not confuse urgency with truth or complexity with wisdom. Staying oriented is enough. Under pressure, enough is often the difference between collapse and movement. Chapter 13. The Cost of Clarity. Clarity is not free. It carries costs that are rarely acknowledged because they are quiet and cumulative rather than dramatic. Under pressure, these costs become more visible. To think clearly when conditions are constrained often means moving more slowly than others, speaking less than expected, and resisting the pull of certainty when certainty is socially rewarded. Clarity extracts a price in speed, recognition, and sometimes belonging. One cost of clarity is solitude. When thinking remains provisional and restrained, it does not always translate well into group dynamics that favor confidence and decisiveness. Clear thinkers may appear hesitant, uncommitted, or insufficiently enthusiastic. Their caution can be misread as lack of conviction. Under pressure, groups often prefer momentum to orientation, and those who slow the pace risk being sidelined. Another cost is discomfort. Clarity requires tolerating unresolved questions. It asks the mind to remain open where others close, to hold ambiguity where others choose sides. This posture is emotionally demanding. It offers fewer psychological rewards than certainty, fewer moments of relief. Over time, this can feel isolating, especially in environments that mistake emotional intensity for engagement. Clarity also limits the stories one can tell oneself. Under pressure, many people rely on narratives that justify their actions and protect their identity. These narratives may be incomplete or distorted, but they provide comfort. Clarity disrupts this comfort. It exposes trade-offs, acknowledges loss, and admits uncertainty. Living without these protective stories can feel stark, even when it is honest. There is also a cost in outcomes. Clear thinking does not guarantee success. It does not align perfectly with systems optimized for speed, visibility, or extraction. Sometimes those who act decisively without clarity advance faster, at least in the short term. Clarity may prevent certain mistakes, but it does not always produce visible wins. Its benefits often appear as disasters that did not occur, paths that were not taken, damage that was avoided. This asymmetry makes clarity hard to defend internally. When success is measured by accumulation or recognition, clarity can feel like self-sabotage. The mind may question whether restraint is actually fear, whether orientation is actually avoidance. These doubts are part of the cost. They cannot be fully eliminated. They must be carried. Yet clarity also confers a different kind of advantage. It preserves continuity of self. Under pressure, many people change rapidly in response to external demands. They adapt so thoroughly that they no longer recognize the person making decisions. Clarity slows this erosion. It keeps choices aligned enough with values and capacity that the self remains intelligible over time. Another benefit of clarity is durability. Decisions made with orientation tend to age better. Even when outcomes are unfavorable, the reasoning remains understandable. Regret is possible without self-contempt. This matters more as life accumulates irreversible choices. The ability to live with decisions becomes as important as the decisions themselves. Clarity also reduces internal conflict. While it does not eliminate doubt, it prevents the mind from fragmenting into competing justifications. When thinking remains coherent, energy is conserved. The mind spends less time defending past actions and more time responding to present conditions. Under sustained pressure, this conservation becomes critical. The cost of clarity is therefore not a sign that it is wrong. It is a sign that it does not align perfectly with systems that reward speed, certainty, and display. Choosing clarity is not choosing safety. It is choosing a different risk profile. It trades external validation for internal coherence, rapid advancement for recoverable movement. In pressured environments, this trade-off must be made consciously. Clarity should not be romanticized as purity or superiority. It is a tool, not a virtue. There will be moments when speed matters more than orientation, when decisiveness outweighs nuance. Clarity does not forbid these choices, it contextualizes them. To think clearly under pressure is to accept that some costs are unavoidable. The question is not whether clarity costs something, but whether the cost is affordable. For many, especially over time, the cost of losing orientation, of becoming reactive, rigid, or unrecognizable to oneself, is higher. Clarity is not the absence of error. It is the presence of alignment. Under pressure, alignment is fragile and valuable. Paying its cost is not always easy, but it keeps the mind from becoming another casualty of conditions it did not choose. In the end, clarity does not promise victory. It promises continuity. And under pressure, continuity is often the quiet difference between enduring and unraveling. Chapter 14. When clarity fails. There are moments when clarity does not arrive, no matter how carefully the mind is oriented. Pressure persists. Information remains incomplete. Emotions stay loud, and decisions must still be made. In these moments, the failure is not personal, and it is not final. It is structural. Clarity is not always available, and expecting it to be can create a second layer of strain. When clarity fails, the mind often responds with self-criticism. It interprets confusion as weakness, hesitation as incompetence, uncertainty as deficiency. This response compounds the problem. It adds judgment to an already constrained system. Under pressure, self-attack rarely sharpens thinking. It accelerates collapse by consuming the limited bandwidth that remains. Another common response is substitution. When clarity is absent, people borrow certainty from elsewhere, from authority, ideology, group consensus, or rigid rules. These substitutes offer relief. They reduce the burden of judgment by transferring responsibility outward. Sometimes this is necessary. No one can evaluate everything alone. But when substitution becomes automatic, agency erodes. Decisions are made, but they are no longer owned. There is also the temptation of force. When clarity does not emerge, the mind may attempt to impose it through effort, thinking harder, longer, more intensely. This usually backfires. Under pressure, additional cognitive load deepens distortion. Thought becomes brittle. The same arguments repeat with greater urgency, but no new resolution. What feels like persistence is often exhaustion disguised as determination. Understanding failure of clarity requires accepting a difficult truth. Some situations cannot be fully understood from the inside. Perspective is limited by position. Certain information is inaccessible until time passes or movement occurs. In these cases, waiting for clarity is equivalent to waiting for conditions to change on their own. Often, they will not. When clarity fails, the question shifts. Instead of asking, "What is the right decision?" the more workable question becomes, "What decision is least likely to compound harm?" This reframing lowers the threshold. It does not aim for optimization. It aims for containment. It accepts that the decision may be flawed, but seeks to prevent cascading damage. Another useful shift is from outcome to process. When clarity is unavailable, evaluating decisions by their eventual success or failure becomes misleading. Outcomes depend on factors beyond control. Process remains accessible. Was the decision made with awareness of constraints? Were emotions acknowledged rather than denied? Was reversibility preserved where possible? These criteria do not guarantee success, but they preserve integrity of judgment. It is also important to recognize that clarity can fail intermittently rather than completely. There may be brief moments of orientation embedded within longer periods of confusion. These moments are easy to dismiss because they do not last. Yet they matter. They offer directional cues rather than full maps. Under pressure, direction is often enough. In some cases, clarity fails because the cost of seeing clearly is temporarily too high. Certain truths cannot be integrated while other pressures remain unresolved. The mind defers clarity as a protective measure. This is not denial in the pathological sense. It is sequencing. Understanding arrives when capacity returns. Forcing it early can be destabilizing. Failure of clarity does not mean abandonment of thinking. It means a change in posture. The mind moves from analysis to stewardship, protecting resources, maintaining position, avoiding irreversible commitments. Thinking becomes less about insight and more about holding ground until conditions shift. Modern narratives often frame clarity as a moral achievement, something owed to oneself and others. This framing is harsh and unrealistic. Under sustained pressure, clarity is a fluctuating resource, not a constant obligation. Treating it as a duty creates guilt when it is absent and pride when it is present. Neither is helpful. When clarity fails, the most stabilizing move is often modesty. Accepting limitation without dramatizing it. Making smaller decisions. Reducing scope. Seeking feedback through action rather than contemplation. Allowing time to do what thinking cannot yet accomplish. Eventually, clarity tends to return, not as a revelation, but as a quiet reorganization. Pieces that did not fit begin to align. Emotional intensity softens. Attention widens slightly. This return cannot be scheduled. It can only be prepared for by not burning the system down in its absence. Thinking under pressure is not a linear ascent toward ever greater clarity. It is a cycle of compression and release, insight and obscurity. When clarity fails, the task is not to panic or to compensate, but to remain intact enough for the next opening. Failure of clarity is part of the terrain. Treating it as such prevents it from becoming a verdict on the self. Under pressure, survival of judgment sometimes means knowing when to wait, when to move, and when to accept that seeing clearly is not yet possible, and acting accordingly. Chapter 15. Choosing what to carry forward. Pressure leaves marks, but not all of them are injuries. Some are adaptations that deserve to be kept. Others are temporary distortions that should be released once conditions allow. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between the two. When pressure recedes, the mind does not automatically sort what was learned from what was merely endured. That sorting requires reflection, and reflection often comes late. Under sustained pressure, people develop habits that are functional in the moment. Narrowed focus, emotional containment, cautious movement, reduced trust. These habits can preserve stability when options are limited. But if carried forward unexamined, they begin to constrain life even when constraint is no longer required. What once protected orientation can later restrict it. Choosing what to carry forward means revisiting these adaptations without judgment. It involves asking which ways of thinking increased resilience and which merely reduced exposure. Some strategies sharpen discernment. Others simply lower risk by shrinking engagement. The former can remain useful. The latter may need to be loosened. One adaptation worth preserving is the ability to tolerate uncertainty without immediate resolution. Pressure teaches this skill brutally but effectively. Carrying it forward allows thinking to remain flexible, even when stakes rise again. Another is the capacity to act with incomplete information while preserving reversibility. This skill prevents paralysis in future moments of ambiguity. Other adaptations are less durable. Hypervigilance, for example, often persists beyond its usefulness. It keeps attention locked on threat even when threat has diminished. Over time, this drains energy and distorts perception. Similarly, emotional numbing can protect against overwhelm under pressure, but it also reduces sensitivity to opportunity and connection once safety returns. There is also the question of identity. Pressure can quietly redefine how people see themselves, as cautious rather than curious, guarded rather than open, pragmatic rather than hopeful. Some of these shifts reflect genuine growth, others reflect fatigue. Choosing what to carry forward requires separating self-knowledge from self-contraction. This process is rarely decisive. It unfolds gradually as the mind tests which postures still fit. Discomfort often signals misalignment. When a once useful habit begins to chafe, it may be time to loosen it. Conversely, when a skill developed under pressure continues to stabilize judgment, it has earned its place. Importantly, carrying forward does not mean preserving pressure itself. Some people confuse endurance with identity, believing that staying tense maintains strength. In reality, strength under pressure comes from adaptability, not from permanent rigidity. Carrying forward the lessons of pressure does not require carrying forward its weight. Another risk is nostalgia for clarity gained under constraint. Pressure can produce sharp insights precisely because options are limited. When life opens up again, thinking may feel less intense, less urgent. This can be misread as loss of depth. In truth, it is often a sign of regained capacity. Clarity does not need constant pressure to exist. Choosing what to carry forward is also an ethical act. Decisions made under pressure shape character. Some compromises were necessary. Others were expedient. Reviewing them with honesty allows integrity to be restored without self-condemnation. This does not mean rewriting the past, but understanding it in context. The aim is not to return to who one was before pressure. That is neither possible nor desirable. The aim is integration. Pressure reveals limits, refines judgment, and exposes vulnerabilities. Carrying forward what was learned while releasing what was merely endured allows the mind to move without dragging excess weight. As conditions change, this integration continues. New pressures will arise. Old skills will be tested again. The value of choosing what to carry forward is that it prevents each cycle of pressure from accumulating into permanent constriction. The mind remains capable of renewal. Thinking under pressure leaves residue, but it also leaves resources. The task is to recognize which is which. Carry forward what preserves orientation, coherence, and adaptability. Let go of what was only meant to help you survive the narrow passage. In doing so, the mind honors the strain it endured without allowing that strain to define its future. Chapter 16. Living with open questions. Not all questions close. Some remain unresolved not because of negligence or avoidance, but because resolution is not yet possible. Under pressure, this reality is especially difficult to accept. The mind is trained to seek closure, to equate answers with safety and certainty with progress. When answers do not arrive, unease follows. Yet many of the most consequential questions in life, about direction, trust, meaning, or timing, cannot be settled decisively in the moment they are felt. Living with open questions requires a shift in how thinking is valued. Instead of treating unanswered questions as failures of reasoning, they are recognized as indicators of complexity. An open question often marks the boundary of what can be known under current conditions. Pushing beyond that boundary does not yield insight. It produces speculation. Pressure intensifies the urge to speculate, but speculation rarely stabilizes judgment. Open questions demand a different posture, patience without passivity. This is not waiting in the sense of doing nothing, nor is it deferral disguised as caution. It is the capacity to act locally while holding uncertainty globally. Decisions continue to be made, but they are framed as provisional responses rather than final resolutions. The mind learns to move without insisting on closure. One reason open questions are difficult to live with is that they resist narrative. Stories depend on arcs, on beginnings that lead to endings. Open questions disrupt this structure. They create a sense of suspension that can feel intolerable, especially when identity or future is at stake. Under pressure, people often rush to impose a story simply to escape this suspension. The story may not be true, but it provides relief. Living with open questions also challenges control. Unanswered questions expose limits of influence, of foresight, of authority. For individuals accustomed to responsibility or command, This exposure can feel like loss. Yet refusing to acknowledge these limits does not remove them. It merely hides them behind confident assertion. Over time, this denial erodes trust in one's own judgment. There is also a social dimension. Many environments reward decisiveness and penalize uncertainty. Admitting that a question remains open can be read as weakness or indecision. Under pressure, this social cost discourages honesty. People learn to present answers they do not fully believe, committing to positions they have not finished examining. The internal cost of this performance accumulates quietly. Living with open questions preserves integrity of thought. It allows the mind to remain aligned with reality rather than with expectation. This alignment is not comfortable. It requires tolerating ambiguity and resisting the impulse to simplify prematurely. But it prevents the kind of rigidity that forms when answers are forced before they are earned. Open questions also create space for emergence. Some understanding cannot be reached through analysis alone. It arrives through sequence, through action, consequence, and time. When the mind insists on resolving everything internally, it blocks this process. Allowing a question to remain open invites reality to participate in the answer. This does not mean abandoning discernment. Some questions can and should be closed when sufficient information exists. The challenge lies in distinguishing between questions that are ready for resolution and those that are not. Under pressure, this distinction blurs. The mind treats all uncertainty as intolerable. Learning to discriminate between resolvable and irresolvable questions is itself a form of clarity. Living with open questions also alters the experience of time. Instead of racing toward answers, the mind begins to notice intervals. It pays attention to what changes and what persists. Patterns emerge not through force, but through observation. This slower tempo can feel countercultural in environments driven by urgency, but it restores proportion. There is humility in this posture, but also strength. It takes resilience to carry uncertainty without collapsing into either paralysis or false certainty. It requires trust in one's capacity to respond later, when conditions change. That trust is not optimism. It is confidence earned through endurance. In the end, living with open questions is not a temporary compromise. It is a permanent feature of thinking in a complex world. Pressure exposes this fact by stripping away illusions of control. Those who can live with open questions remain flexible. Those who cannot often harden prematurely. Thinking under pressure does not culminate in complete understanding. It culminates in a way of moving that remains responsive even when answers are incomplete. Open questions are not obstacles to clarity. They are part of its terrain. Chapter 17. Pressure as a permanent condition. Pressure is no longer an exception. It is not a crisis that arrives, disrupts life, and then recedes. For many, it has become the background condition against which thinking, working, and deciding now occur. Economic uncertainty, institutional surveillance, accelerated timeframes, and social exposure have converged to produce an environment where relief is intermittent and provisional. The question is no longer how to think when pressure appears, but how to think when pressure does not fully leave. This shift changes the meaning of adaptation. In earlier contexts, pressure was something to endure temporarily. Skills developed under strain could be relaxed once stability returned. In a permanent pressure environment, adaptation must be sustainable. Postures that rely on constant vigilance, urgency, or emotional suppression eventually exhaust the system. What once functioned as emergency response becomes chronic stress. Permanent pressure also alters incentives. Speed is rewarded over judgment, visibility over substance, responsiveness over orientation. These incentives shape behavior quietly. People learn to appear decisive even when uncertain, to stay reachable even when depleted, to perform clarity even when none exists. Over time, the performance becomes internalized. Thinking aligns itself with what is demanded rather than with what is accurate. In such conditions, the risk is not simply poor decisions. It is erosion of the capacity to decide at all. When pressure never fully lifts, the mind has fewer opportunities to recalibrate. Errors accumulate without being integrated. Fatigue masquerades as realism. Cynicism replaces discernment. The internal compass weakens not through failure, but through overuse. Treating pressure as permanent does not mean surrendering to it. It means adjusting expectations. Clarity becomes episodic rather than continuous. Recovery becomes partial rather than complete. The aim shifts from restoration to maintenance. Thinking must be structured so that it can function adequately even when ideal conditions are unavailable. This requires prioritizing durability over optimization. Durable thinking tolerates ambiguity, accepts imperfection, and preserves reversibility. It avoids all-or-nothing commitments that assume stability will follow. Instead, it builds slack where possible. Time, energy, optionality. Not as luxuries, but as necessities. In permanent pressure, slack is not waste. It is survival margin. Another implication is the need to distinguish between pressure imposed by circumstance and pressure adopted as identity. Some people come to rely on pressure as a source of meaning. Urgency provides focus. Constraint provides justification. Letting go of pressure can feel like losing purpose. In a permanent pressure environment, this identification is tempting and dangerous. It prevents the mind from recognizing when strain is unnecessary or self-inflicted. Thinking clearly under permanent pressure also demands selectivity in engagement. Not every demand can be met. Not every signal deserves response. Treating all inputs as equally binding guarantees fragmentation. Judgment must include refusal of tasks, narratives, timelines, and expectations that exceed capacity. This refusal is not defiance. It is conservation. There is also a moral dimension to permanent pressure. Systems that operate this way externalize cost. They rely on individuals to absorb strain privately while presenting collective efficiency publicly. Recognizing this does not immediately change conditions, but it prevents misplaced self-blame. When clarity falters under constant demand, the cause is often structural rather than personal. Living under permanent pressure reshapes ambition. Goals framed in terms of accumulation or dominance often become hollow when maintenance itself is costly. Ambition shifts toward continuity, staying intact, preserving judgment, avoiding irreversible harm. This is not resignation. It is recalibration. What counts as success changes when conditions harden. In this environment, the value of a working model becomes clearer. It is not a temporary aid for crises, but a standing orientation. It allows thinking to remain functional without demanding peak performance. It accepts that some degradation is inevitable and plans around it. This acceptance is not defeat, it is realism. Pressure as a permanent condition does not eliminate the possibility of clarity. It changes its texture. Clarity becomes quieter, shorter-lived, and less dramatic. It appears in moments rather than states. The task is to recognize these moments and use them well, without expecting them to last. The future will likely bring more pressure, not less. Complexity is increasing. Control is centralizing. Uncertainty is spreading. In such a world, the ability to think adequately under strain may matter more than the ability to think brilliantly in comfort. This book has not argued for transcendence or escape. It has argued for sufficiency. Under permanent pressure, sufficiency is a serious achievement. It keeps judgment alive where it might otherwise erode. It allows the mind to remain oriented enough to choose, even when choice is constrained. One chapter remains, not to offer solutions, but to settle the posture that endures when pressure no longer feels temporary and thinking must continue anyway. Chapter 18. What remains? When pressure becomes familiar, something subtle happens to thinking. The drama fades. The urgency dulls. What remains is not ease, but a quieter form of competence. Decisions continue to be made, often without confidence, sometimes without clarity, yet with a steadiness that does not require constant reassurance. This steadiness is not heroic, it is functional. What remains, first, is proportion. Under sustained pressure, the mind learns, slowly and imperfectly, which things truly matter and which merely insist. Not everything urgent is important. Not everything loud is consequential. This distinction is rarely grasped all at once. It emerges through repetition, through mistakes that were costly enough to be instructive, but not catastrophic. Proportion is not insight, it is calibration. What remains, second, is restraint. Not the restraint of fear, but the restraint of experience. The mind becomes less eager to react, less compelled to explain itself, less invested in total resolution. It learns that many problems do not need to be solved immediately in order to be lived with. This restraint does not eliminate action. It sharpens it. What remains, third, is tolerance for ambiguity. The demand for certainty weakens, not because certainty has been achieved, but because its absence is no longer destabilizing. Open questions persist without dominating attention. Decisions are made with the understanding that revision is likely. This tolerance is not indifference. It is endurance of the unfinished. There is also a quieter shift in identity. Under pressure, many people define themselves by performance, resilience, or survival. Over time, this becomes exhausting. What remains instead is a simpler self-understanding, someone who continues, someone who does not require constant justification, someone who can live with partial success and incomplete explanation. This is not lowering standards. It is choosing a standard that can be sustained. Another thing that remains is a reduced appetite for spectacle. Pressure strips away fascination with intensity for its own sake. Grand narratives lose their appeal. Excess emotion feels costly rather than meaningful. The mind gravitates toward what is workable, repeatable, and sufficient. This narrowing is not impoverishment. It is refinement. Importantly, what remains is not optimism. This book has not argued for optimism, and it does not end there. Optimism depends on expectation. Pressure teaches the mind to operate without expectation. What replaces optimism is something quieter: willingness. Willingness to engage without guarantees. Willingness to decide without certainty. Willingness to continue without reassurance. What also remains is memory, not just of events, but of internal states. The mind remembers how it fractured, how it recovered, how it adapted. This memory becomes a reference point. When pressure rises again, as it will, the mind recognizes the terrain. It knows that distortion is likely, that clarity may fail, that sufficiency is enough. This recognition reduces panic. It shortens the distance between disruption and orientation. In the end, thinking under pressure does not culminate in mastery. It culminates in continuity. The ability to keep thinking without demanding brilliance, to keep deciding without demanding certainty, to keep acting without demanding resolution. This continuity is rarely celebrated. It does not announce itself. Yet it is what allows a life to remain navigable when conditions harden. Nothing in this book guarantees favorable outcomes. Pressure does not negotiate. Constraint does not reward virtue. But thinking that remains intact under strain reduces unnecessary damage. It preserves agency where it might otherwise erode. It allows the mind to stay present enough to respond when opportunity appears, even briefly. What remains, finally, is a posture. Not a method, not a doctrine, not a system. A posture that accepts pressure as real, limits as binding, and thinking as imperfect, but still worth doing. This posture does not promise relief. It promises coherence. When pressure becomes normal, coherence is enough. Chapter 19. Enough. There is a temptation at the end of any sustained effort to add one more layer of meaning, to extract a lesson, to summarize, to reassure. Under pressure, this temptation is especially strong. It reflects a desire to close the loop, to turn endurance into explanation. But not everything needs to be resolved to be complete. What this book has traced is not a path toward mastery, but a way of remaining functional when mastery is unavailable. It is not argued that pressure can be overcome, only that it can be met without surrendering judgment entirely. This distinction matters. Many people collapse not because conditions are impossible, but because they demand from themselves a level of clarity, certainty, or control that the environment will not permit. Enough is a difficult word in cultures organized around accumulation, optimization, and display. Enough sounds like settling, like retreat, like failure dressed up as acceptance. Under pressure, however, enough is often the difference between persistence and collapse. It is the point at which thinking stops consuming itself. Enough thinking is thinking that does not spiral. Enough clarity is clarity that allows movement. Enough action is action that does not foreclose the future. This sense of enough is not passive. It is calibrated. It arises from contact with limits of time, energy, knowledge, and control. Rather than denying these limits, it works within them. It does not pretend that better effort will dissolve constraint. It asks what can be done without breaking what must endure. Pressure narrows life. It forces choices earlier than one would like. It exposes trade-offs that are usually hidden. In doing so, it removes certain illusions. One of them is the illusion that thinking must always lead to certainty. Another is the illusion that clarity must always feel good. Often, clarity under pressure feels spare, incomplete, and unsatisfying. It still matters. There is no final technique that guarantees good decisions in hard conditions. There is only posture, practiced repeatedly. Recognize distortion. Narrow scope. Preserve reversibility. Account for emotion. Accept imperfection. Return to orientation when it slips. This posture does not make life fair or outcomes favorable. It makes them survivable. If there is a quiet ethic running through these pages, it is this: do not demand from yourself what the conditions do not allow. Pressure already extracts its cost. Adding self-condemnation multiplies the damage. Thinking under pressure is not about rising above circumstance. It is about not being crushed by it. Enough is not an endpoint. It is a threshold. It marks the point at which thinking remains possible without becoming self-destructive. Beyond that threshold lies exhaustion, rigidity, and illusion. Staying on this side of it is an achievement, even if it feels unremarkable. This book ends without a call to action, because action is already underway. Anyone reading it has been thinking under pressure long before these words appeared. The aim was not to change that fact, but to make it more intelligible, to give language to what is often endured silently. When conditions tighten again, as they will, nothing here will eliminate the strain. But some of it may return as recognition, a moment of pause, a slight widening, a reminder that sufficiency is not failure. That is enough.